The biting winter wind howled through the canyons of Colorado Territory like a wounded beast, carrying with it the promise of death for those caught unprepared. Faith Goodwin clutched her infant son closer to her chest as she trudged through the deepening snow, each step more laborious than the last. The wagon wheel had broken 6 miles back, and her husband Thomas lay buried beneath a crude pile of rocks 2 days prior, victim to a bandit's bullet during their ill-fated journey west. "Hold on, James," she whispered to the bundle in her arms, her voice trembling as much from fear as from cold. "Mama is going to get us to Georgetown, just a little farther." But even as she spoke the words, Faith knew they might be lies. The storm had grown fiercer since nightfall, and her thin shawl offered little protection against the elements. The baby had stopped crying an hour ago, a sign that terrified her more than his previous wails. His small face had taken on a bluish tint, his breathing shallow and intermittent. At 23, Faith had already endured more hardship than most women twice her age. Orphaned at 16, married at 19 to a man with dreams of striking silver in the Colorado mines, and widowed just 3 days ago. Now, as the snow reached past her ankles and the temperature continued to drop, she feared she would lose the only thing she had left in this world, her 7-month-old son. Faith stumbled, nearly dropping the baby as she caught herself against a snow-laden pine. Her fingers were numb, her lips cracked and bleeding. Georgetown had to be close. The last traveler she'd encountered had said it was less than a day's journey. But that had been before the storm, before darkness fell, before her strength began to fail her. In the distance, a flicker of light caught her eye. Hope surged through her veins like wildfire, giving her legs a renewed burst of energy. She pushed forward, ignoring the painful sting of snow and ice against her face. "Please," she prayed, the word escaping her lips in a cloud of visible breath. "Please let it be shelter." As she drew closer, the light materialized into the warm glow of a lantern hanging outside what appeared to be a small cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth within. Faith's heart leapt with desperate joy. With the last of her strength, she staggered toward the door and raised her hand to knock. Before her knuckles could make contact with the wood, her legs finally gave out. She crumpled to her knees, still clutching James protectively to her chest as consciousness began to slip away. The door swung open, revealing a tall figure silhouetted against the light. "Good God Almighty!" a deep voice exclaimed. Faith looked up into the face of a stranger, a man with weathered features and concerned green eyes beneath the brim of a wide hat. His expression shifted from surprise to alarm as he took in the sight of her and the motionless bundle in her arms. "My baby," she managed to whisper. "Please, help my baby." The man moved with surprising speed for his size, kneeling beside her in the snow. "Madam, can you stand?" Faith tried to nod, but her body refused to cooperate. The stranger seemed to understand, sweeping her into his arms with the baby still clutched to her chest. The warmth of the cabin hit her like a physical force as he carried them inside, kicking the door shut behind him. "Name's Garrett Townsend," he said, setting her down on a chair near the roaring fireplace. "Most folks call me Gary." Faith tried to respond, but her attention was fixed on James, who hadn't stirred despite the jostling and sudden change in temperature. She pulled back the thin blanket to reveal his pale face. "He's so cold," she whispered, panic rising in her voice. "He's not waking up." Gary crouched before her, his expression grave as he assessed the infant. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his thick leather coat lined with sheep's wool and reached for the baby. "Madam, your little one's suffering from the cold, something fierce." "If you'll permit me," Faith nodded desperately, transferring her precious burden into the stranger's large, capable hands. Gary wrapped the coat around the infant, creating a cocoon of warmth. "This coat's seen me through 15 winters out here," he said softly. "Reckon it's got more important work to do now." "But you'll freeze," Faith protested weakly. Gary's eyes met hers, something ineffable passing between them. "I've lived long enough," he said simply. "This little fella's just getting started." He placed the bundled baby close to the fire, then turned his attention back to Faith. "You're half frozen yourself, madam. Let me fetch you some blankets and something hot to drink." As Gary moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency, Faith watched him through bleary eyes. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with broad shoulders and the bow-legged stance of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. His beard was neatly trimmed, dark brown with hints of red that caught the firelight. Despite his rugged appearance, there was a gentleness to his movements that spoke of a kind heart. He returned with several wool blankets, draping them around her shoulders, then pressed a tin cup of steaming coffee into her trembling hands. "Drink this. Got a bit of sugar and it helped bring your strength back." Faith sipped gratefully, the hot liquid spreading warmth through her chest. "Faith," she managed between sips. "Faith Goodwin, and that's James." Gary nodded, returning his attention to the baby. With careful hands, he opened the coat enough to check on the infant. "He's starting to pink up a bit," he observed. "That's a good sign, got to warm him slow and steady." Faith felt tears spring to her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself since Thomas had fallen. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Townsend." "Gary," he corrected gently. "And there's no need for thanks. Couldn't rightly call myself a man if I turned away a woman and child on a night like this." For the next hour, they took turns holding James close to the fire, wrapped in Gary's coat. Slowly, the baby's color improved, and eventually he began to fuss the most beautiful sound Faith had ever heard. "There he is," Gary said, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Got some fight in him, your boy does." Faith reached for her son, cradling him against her chest as tears of relief flowed freely down her cheeks. "I thought I'd lost him," she whispered. "After Thomas, after everything, I couldn't bear to lose him too." Gary's expression softened with understanding. "Thomas was your husband?" Faith nodded, the grief still raw and bleeding inside her. "Bandits, 3 days ago, just past Denver. They wanted our wagon, our supplies." Thomas tried to reason with them. Her voice broke. "James and I hid in the brush. I had to leave him there by the side of the trail, just some rocks to mark his grave." Gary's jaw tightened, a flash of anger crossing his features before he controlled it. "I'm mighty sorry to hear that, Mrs. Goodwin. This territory can be unforgiving to decent folk." "Please," she said quietly, "call me Faith." Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, rattling the shutters of the small cabin. Gary moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "Storm's getting worse. You're welcome to stay here until it passes. Ain't much, but it's warm and dry." Faith looked around the cabin for the first time, taking in her surroundings. It was indeed small, just one room with a fireplace, a narrow bed against the far wall, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves stocked with provisions. Simple, but tidy and well-maintained. "I couldn't impose, it's no imposition," Gary interrupted firmly. "I'll sleep by the fire. You and the little one take the bed." Too exhausted to argue, Faith nodded gratefully. "We were bound for Georgetown," she explained. "Thomas had a cousin there working the mines. Said he'd help us get settled." Gary nodded thoughtfully. "Georgetown's not far, about 4 miles, but in this weather might as well be 40. You'll stay put till it's safe to travel." His tone brooked no argument. As the night deepened, James finally fell into a peaceful sleep, his breathing strong and regular. Faith placed him carefully on the bed, building a barrier of blankets to prevent him from rolling off. Gary had busied himself preparing a simple meal of beans and salt pork, and the aroma made Faith's stomach growl audibly. Gary smiled as he served her a generous portion. "Been a while since you've eaten proper, I'm guessing." Faith nodded, embarrassed. "We lost most of our supplies in the attack. I've been rationing what little we had left." They ate in companionable silence, the crackling fire and howling wind the only sounds. When Faith had finished, Gary took her plate and set it aside, then refilled her coffee cup. "If you don't mind my asking," he said carefully, "what was your plan once you reached Georgetown? Your husband's cousin, he expecting you?" Faith sighed, the weight of her uncertain future settling heavily on her shoulders. "Samuel, that's Thomas's cousin, doesn't know we were coming. Thomas was sure he'd help us, but—" She trailed off, unsure of her next steps in a world suddenly turned upside down. Gary seemed to understand her unspoken fears. "Georgetown's a rough place for a woman alone, especially with a young'un. Mining towns full of hard men with harder hearts." "I don't have much choice," Faith replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "I have some skills I can sew, cook, keep accounts. Thomas taught me to shoot, though I'm not very good, whatever it takes to provide for James." Gary studied her face for a long moment, then nodded with something like respect. Courage isn't lacking in you, that's plain to see, still it won't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever is, Faith responded, echoing words her father had often spoken before consumption had taken him and her mother within weeks of each other. As the evening wore on, exhaustion finally claimed Faith. Gary insisted she take the bed, and despite her protestations, she eventually relented, curling up beside her sleeping son. The last thing she remembered before drifting off was the silhouette of Gary stoking the fire, his coat still wrapped protectively around James. Faith woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, and James was making contented cooing sounds beside her. The events of the previous night came rushing back, and she sat up quickly, scanning the room. Gary stood at the stove, his back to her as he worked over what smelled like breakfast. Without his coat, she could see the breadth of his shoulders beneath a faded red flannel shirt. He must have sensed her gaze, for he turned and offered a tentative smile. "Morning. Hope I didn't wake you. Figured you and the little one could use some nourishment." Faith ran a self-conscious hand through her tangled hair. "What time is it?" "Just past 9. Storm broke about an hour ago. Sun's out, but there's near 2 feet of snow on the ground." Faith swung her legs over the side of the bed, checking on James, who seemed remarkably recovered from his ordeal. His cheeks were pink, his eyes bright as he reached for her. "He seems much better," she observed with relief. Gary nodded, approaching with a steaming plate of what appeared to be cornmeal mush with a dollop of molasses. "Youngsters bounce back quick. Reckon he's got his mama's strength." Faith accepted the plate gratefully. "I need to thank you properly, Mr. Townsend, Gary. You saved both our lives last night." Gary waved away her thanks, looking slightly uncomfortable with the praise. "Any decent man would have done the same." "I'm not so sure of that," Faith replied softly. "There seems to be a shortage of decent men in this territory from what I've seen." Gary's expression darkened briefly before he turned back to the stove. "Bad elements in every place, I suppose, but there's good folks too once you know where to look." As Faith ate, Gary pulled on a worn sheepskin vest and headed for the door. "Need to check on my horse and clear some of this snow. Won't be long." Left alone, Faith took the opportunity to attend to James and make herself more presentable. She found a basin of water that Gary had thoughtfully left warming near the stove and used it to wash both herself and the baby. By the time Gary returned, stamping snow from his boots, she felt more human than she had in days. "Your color's better," he observed, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Reckon you might be ready to hear what I've been thinking." Faith tilted her head questioningly, settling James on her lap. "Been considering your situation," Gary continued, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "And I'd like to make a proposition, a proper one, mind you," he added hastily, a flush creeping up his neck. Faith waited, curious despite the wariness that experience had taught her was necessary around men and their propositions. "I'm heading into Georgetown myself in a day or two once the trail's passable. Got some business with the assayer's office." Gary seemed uncharacteristically nervous, fidgeting with his coffee cup. "Thought I might make inquiries about your husband's cousin, see if he's still in town, and maybe put in a word for you at the boarding house. Mrs. Peterson, who runs it, is a good Christian woman. Might take you on, give you work and a place to stay till you get your bearings." Faith was momentarily speechless at his thoughtfulness. "That's extremely kind of you," Gary shrugged, looking out the window. "Least I can do," and I was thinking. He hesitated, then seemed to gather his courage. "My place here isn't much, but you're welcome to stay until we get things sorted. Safer than trying to make your way to town with the little one in these conditions." Faith considered his offer. Under normal circumstances, she would never consider staying alone with a strange man, regardless of how kindly he seemed. But these were hardly normal circumstances, and Gary had already proven himself to be trustworthy. More importantly, James's welfare had to be her primary concern. "I accept," she said finally. "And I insist on earning my keep. I noticed your shirts could use mending, and I'm sure there are other ways I can help around here." Relief washed over Gary's face, followed quickly by a smile that transformed his weathered features, making him appear years younger. That's settled then. Welcome to Townsend Ranch, such as it is. Over the next 3 days, Faith and Gary fell into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. While he tended to his small herd of cattle and repaired fences damaged by the storm, Faith put the cabin in order, mended clothing, and prepared meals from the simple provisions available. James thrived in the warm, safe environment, his personality beginning to shine through as he recovered from their ordeal. Faith learned that Gary had come to Colorado Territory 8 years earlier, after serving in the Union Army during the war between the states. He'd staked his claim to this small valley, building the cabin with his own hands and slowly acquiring a modest herd of cattle that provided his livelihood. Unlike many in the territory, he wasn't chasing silver dreams but preferred the honest work of ranching. Never much cared for going underground, he explained one evening as they sat by the fire, James sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle Gary had fashioned from a wooden crate. Saw enough dark places during the war to last a lifetime. Faith sensed there was more to that story. Shadows behind his eyes hinted at memories best left undisturbed, but she didn't pry. Everyone had their burdens to bear, their private sorrows. Instead, she shared stories of her own life. Growing up in Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a cabinet maker, the devastating illness that had taken both her parents when she was 16. The 3 years she'd spent working as a shopgirl in St. Louis before meeting Thomas, a charismatic dreamer with silver in his eyes. He painted such a picture of our life out west, Faith said softly, gazing into the flames. A fine house in Georgetown, respectability, prosperity. I wanted to believe him. She smiled sadly. I did believe him. Gary's expression was contemplative as he whittled a small piece of wood, his hands steady and sure. Dreams aren't bad things to have, he offered. Just need to be tempered with a dose of reality now and then. Faith nodded, watching his hands as they shaped the wood with careful precision. What are you making? Gary looked almost embarrassed. Thought the boy might like a little horse to play with when he's bigger. Not much, but it's wonderful, Faith interrupted, touched by the gesture. Truly. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the snap of the fire and the soft sounds of Gary's knife against wood. Faith found herself studying his profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw beneath his beard. The slight crook in his nose that suggested it had been broken at some point, the way his brow furrowed in concentration as he worked. For the first time since Thomas's death, Faith felt a flutter of something other than grief in her chest. The realization startled her, and she quickly looked away, focusing instead on her mending. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the snow beginning to recede under the influence of the Colorado sun. Gary announced it was time to make the journey into Georgetown. Trail should be passable now, he said over breakfast. We'll take the wagon. Be there before midday if we leave soon. Faith felt a curious reluctance at the prospect of leaving the cabin that had become a sanctuary, but she knew they couldn't impose on Gary's hospitality indefinitely. Reality awaited in Georgetown, and she needed to face it sooner rather than later. She bundled James warmly, using the coat Gary had insisted they keep. I'll return this once we're settled, she promised as she wrapped the baby. Gary simply shook his head. It belongs to the boy now, consider it a gift. The journey to Georgetown was slower than Gary had anticipated, the trail still treacherous in places where drifts had formed. Faith sat beside him on the wagon seat, James secured in her lap, taking in the breathtaking scenery of snow-capped mountains against a brilliant blue sky. It's beautiful, she murmured, understanding for the first time why men like Thomas were drawn to this rugged land. Gary nodded, his eyes scanning the trail ahead. Has a way of getting under your skin, makes a man feel small and significant all at once. As they rounded a bend, Georgetown came into view in the valley below a collection of wooden buildings clustered along a main street, with scattered structures climbing the surrounding hillsides where the mines operated. Even from a distance, Faith could see it was a busy place, with smoke rising from numerous chimneys and figures moving about the streets. Larger than I expected, she remarked, anxiety creeping into her voice. Grown considerably these past few years with the silver boom, Gary replied. Still rough around the edges, but becoming more civilized. Even got a proper church now and a schoolhouse. As they drew closer to town, the signs of frontier industry became more apparent, the rhythmic pounding of stamp mills crushing ore, the shouts of teamsters driving heavily laden wagons, the general buzz of a community in the midst of growth and transformation. Faith held James closer, suddenly overwhelmed by the noise and activity. After the peaceful isolation of Gary's cabin, Gary seemed to sense her unease. "We'll head straight to the boarding house," he assured her. "Mrs. Peterson's a good sort. Might seem stern at first, but she's got a kind heart underneath." The boarding house stood on a side street, a 3-story wooden structure with green shutters and a small sign identifying it as Peterson's Respectable Lodgings for Ladies and Gentlemen. Gary helped Faith down from the wagon, then gathered her meager belongings. "Wait here," he instructed, handing her the reins. "Let me speak with Mrs. Peterson first." Faith watched as he mounted the steps and disappeared inside. James began to fuss, perhaps sensing her anxiety, and she bounced him gently, murmuring reassurances she didn't entirely feel. What if there was no room? What if Mrs. Peterson wouldn't accept a woman with an infant? What if Thomas's cousin had left Georgetown? After what seemed an eternity, but was likely only 15 minutes, Gary emerged from the boarding house accompanied by a tall, angular woman with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Despite her forbidding appearance, the woman's eyes were kind as they assessed Faith and James. "Mrs. Goodwin, I presume," she said, her voice surprisingly melodious. "I am Mrs. Peterson. Mr. Townsend has explained your situation. Please come inside where it's warm and we can discuss arrangements." Relief washed over Faith as she followed the woman into the boarding house, Gary bringing up the rear with her belongings. The interior was clean and modestly furnished, with a parlor to the right of the entrance hall and what appeared to be a dining room to the left. "I have a small room on the second floor that would suit you and the child," Mrs. Peterson explained, leading them upstairs. "It's not luxurious, but it's clean and has its own stove for heat." The room was indeed small, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small table with a chair, and the promised stove in the corner. A window overlooked the street below, letting in ample light. "It's perfect," Faith said sincerely. "Thank you for accommodating us on such short notice, Mrs. Peterson nodded briskly. "Mr. Townsend speaks highly of you, and I trust his judgment. He tells me you're skilled with a needle and can keep accounts." Faith nodded, adjusting James on her hip. "Yes, madam. My father was a schoolteacher, so I'm well educated. And my mother taught me to sew and manage a household." "Excellent. As it happens, I am in need of assistance. My eyesight isn't what it once was, and the accounts have become something of a burden. If you're willing, I could offer you employment in exchange for your room and board, plus a small wage." Faith could scarcely believe her good fortune. "I would be most grateful for the opportunity, Mrs. Peterson." The older woman's stern countenance softened slightly. "Then it's settled. You'll begin tomorrow. Today, rest and get settled. Supper is served at 6 in the dining room." She turned to Gary, who had been standing quietly in the doorway. "Mr. Townsend, a word before you leave." As the two stepped into the hallway, Faith set James on the bed and began to unpack their few possessions. She could hear murmured conversation outside the door but couldn't make out the words. A few minutes later, Gary returned, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "Mrs. Peterson's agreed to watch the little one while we make inquiries about your husband's cousin," he said. "Thought we might head to the assayer's office first. Most minors register there. If he's still in town, they'll know where to find him." Faith hesitated, looking at James. "Are you certain, Mrs. Peterson won't mind?" Said she'd be delighted. "Has a soft spot for babies, apparently." Gary shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Best we go now, before the offices close for the day." After settling James with Mrs. Peterson, who indeed seemed delighted with the temporary charge, Faith and Gary set out into the bustling streets of Georgetown. The town was a curious mix of frontier rawness and emerging civilization. Saloons and gambling houses stood alongside more respectable establishments, a hotel, A bank, several mercantiles, even a millinery shop with ladies' hats displayed in the window. Men predominated on the streets, many of them miners with weathered faces and rough clothing. They eyed Faith with undisguised interest, some tipping their hats respectfully, others less gentlemanly in their appraisal. Faith was acutely aware of Gary's protective presence beside her, his tall frame and determined stride sending a clear message to would-be harassers. The assayer's office was a brick building near the center of town. Inside, a harried-looking clerk greeted them with barely concealed impatience. "Samuel Goodwin," Gary stated after introducing himself and Faith. "Mining man, been in Georgetown for at least a year or two, Mrs. Goodwin here is kin by marriage," the clerk frowned, consulting a large ledger. Goodwin, ah yes, had a claim up Leavenworth Gulch, hasn't been in to register any ore for." He flipped back several pages. Going on 6 months now, Faith's heart sank. "Is there any record of where he might have gone?" The clerk shrugged indifferently. "Men come and go, could have moved on to another claim, another town, could have gone back east, could be dead in a mine collapse for all I know." Gary's jaw tightened at the man's callousness. "Any way to find out for certain? It's important." Something in Gary's tone made the clerk straighten up and adopt a more helpful demeanor. "Could check with Jenkins at the land office. He keeps records of claim transfers. Or Burke at the prospector's saloon. He seems to know everybody's business." They tried both suggestions, but neither yielded definitive information. Samuel Goodwin had sold his claim 4 months prior, according to Jenkins, but where he'd gone afterward was anybody's guess. At the prospector's saloon, Burke, a one-eyed bartender with a prodigious memory for faces and stories, recalled Samuel as a talker with big dreams and small results who had mentioned California more than once. Way he told it, the silver here wasn't worth the effort when there was gold just waiting to be scooped up in California streams, Burke informed them as he polished glasses. "Heard he headed west with some others about 4 months back. Wouldn't expect him to return anytime soon, if that's what you're hoping." As they left the saloon, Faith struggled to hide her disappointment. She'd known it was a long shot, but some part of her had clung to the hope that Samuel might provide a connection to Thomas, a link to the life they'd planned together. Gary walked beside her in silence for a while, seemingly lost in his own thoughts. Finally, as they approached the boarding house, he cleared his throat. "I'm sorry about your husband's cousin," he said quietly. "Must be a blow." Faith managed a wan smile. "I barely knew him, only met him once at our wedding. It was Thomas who was certain he'd help us." She sighed. "I suppose I'll need to adjust my plans." Gary hesitated, then said carefully, "Mrs. Peterson seems pleased to have you. That's something solid to build on. And Georgetown's growing, there'll be opportunities for a capable woman like yourself." Faith nodded, grateful for his attempt at reassurance. "You've been more than kind, Gary. I don't know how I can ever repay you." A flush crept up Gary's neck, and he looked away, focusing on a point down the street. "No repayment necessary, just want to see you and the boy settled safe." He paused, then added, "I'll be in town for a few days, handling some business. If you need anything at all, I'm staying at the Silver Dollar Hotel." As they reached the boarding house steps, Faith impulsively placed her hand on Gary's arm. "Will you come for supper tomorrow, Mrs. Peterson mentioned that I'd be helping in the kitchen, and I'd like to cook something special to thank you properly." Gary looked momentarily flustered by the invitation, but nodded. "I'd be honored. Round 6, you said? 6 o'clock, Faith confirmed with a smile. "Don't be late." Inside, she found Mrs. Peterson in the parlor, rocking James gently while reading aloud from a book of poetry. The older woman looked up as Faith entered, a soft expression on her otherwise stern features. "Your son is a delight, Mrs. Goodwin, well-behaved and such bright eyes. He'll be a handsome lad when he grows." Faith felt a surge of maternal pride. "Thank you for watching him. I hope he wasn't any trouble." "None whatsoever." Mrs. Peterson handed James back to Faith, then adjusted her spectacles. "Did you find your husband's cousin?" Faith shook her head. "It seems he left for California several months ago." Mrs. Peterson clicked her tongue sympathetically. "I'm sorry to hear that, but perhaps it's for the best. Family obligations can sometimes be more burden than blessing." She rose from her chair with surprising grace for a woman of her years. Now, I imagine you're both tired from the day's exertions. There's beef stew for supper, simple fare but nourishing, and tomorrow we'll begin your training on the accounts." That night, as Faith lay in the narrow bed with James sleeping peacefully beside her, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. A week ago, she'd been trudging through snow, certain she and her son would perish in the Colorado wilderness. Now she had shelter, employment, and the beginnings of a new life in Georgetown. All because a kind stranger had opened his door on a stormy night and given his coat to save her child. The thought of Gary brought a warmth to her chest that had nothing to do with the small stove heating the room. His quiet strength, his gentle ways with James, his unwavering support all combined to create an impression of a man unlike any she'd known before. Even Thomas, for all his charm and dreams, had never made her feel as safe and respected as Gary Townsend did. It was too soon, she told herself firmly. Too soon after Thomas's death to be thinking of another man in any way beyond friendship. And yet, as sleep claimed her, it was Gary's face, those kind green eyes, that hesitant smile that followed her into dreams. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as Faith began her new duties at the boarding house. Mrs. Peterson proved to be a fair but exacting employer with definite opinions on how things should be done. By midday, Faith's head was spinning with information about the boarding house accounts, the preferences of regular boarders, and the precise way linens should be folded. James, to Faith's relief, seemed content in his new surroundings, especially when Mrs. Peterson insisted on taking him for a proper airing in the small garden behind the house after lunch. Faith used the time to familiarize herself with the kitchen, planning the evening meal with special attention to what she would prepare for Gary's visit. "Mr. Townsend is joining us for supper," she mentioned casually to Mrs. Peterson when the older woman returned with a sleepy James. Mrs. Peterson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is he indeed? Well, that's good news. Gary Townsend is one of the few men in this territory I genuinely respect. A gentleman in the truest sense of the word." Faith was curious about the obvious esteem in which Mrs. Peterson held Gary. "You've known him long, since he first arrived in Georgetown," Mrs. Peterson replied, handing James back to Faith. "He stayed here briefly before finding his land. Even then, he stood out quiet, respectful, never causing trouble like so many of the young men who pass through." She paused, a faraway look in her eyes. "He reminded me of my late husband in some ways, the same steady nature, the same inherent decency." Faith wanted to ask more but sensed Mrs. Peterson had shared as much as she was inclined to. Instead, she focused on practical matters. "For supper, I thought perhaps roast chicken with sage dressing, if that meets with your approval." Mrs. Peterson nodded approvingly. "An excellent choice. Mr. Townsend is partial to apple pie if you've time to prepare one." Faith smiled, grateful for the insight. "I believe I can manage that." The afternoon passed quickly as Faith worked in the kitchen, preparing the evening meal while simultaneously learning Mrs. Peterson's systems and routines. By 5:30, the dining room table was set for the boarding house's 6 regular residents, plus Gary as a special guest. Faith had just placed James in the small cradle Mrs. Peterson had unearthed from the attic when there was a knock at the front door. Smoothing her hair and adjusting her apron, she went to answer it, her heart inexplicably racing. Gary stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking decidedly uncomfortable in what was clearly his Sunday best, a dark wool suit that fit his broad shoulders well, if a bit snugly, and a clean white shirt with a string tie. His hair was slicked back with pomade and his beard had been neatly trimmed. "Evening, Faith," he said, his voice gruff with nervousness. "Hope I'm not early." Faith smiled, suddenly shy herself. "Not at all, please come in." As she led him to the dining room, she was acutely aware of his presence behind her, the sound of his footsteps, the faint scent of soap and leather that seemed to accompany him. Mrs. Peterson was already there, directing the seating arrangements with military precision. "Mr. Townsend." "How delightful to see you," she exclaimed with unusual warmth. "You'll sit here at my right hand. Mrs. Goodwin has prepared a special meal in your honor." Gary's eyes found Faith's, a question in them. "You didn't need to go to any trouble." "It was no trouble," Faith assured him, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks under his gaze. It's the least I could do after everything. The meal proved to be a success, with the other boarders' two elderly sisters, a young clerk from the bank, and two school teachers all complimenting Faith on the food. Gary ate heartily but spoke little, seeming content to listen to the conversation flowing around him. It wasn't until dessert, the apple pie, that earned particular praise that Mrs. Peterson steered the conversation toward Gary directly. "Mr. Townsend, you must tell us the latest news from your part of the valley. I understand the winter has been particularly harsh this year." Gary set down his fork, looking slightly uncomfortable at being the center of attention. "Been a hard one for certain. Lost a few head of cattle to the cold, but most of the herd weathered it well enough." He glanced at Faith. "Been thinking of making some improvements to the place come spring. Maybe adding on to the cabin, building a proper barn." "Expanding, are you?" Mrs. Peterson inquired with a knowing look that made Faith wonder what exactly the two had discussed in the hallway the previous day. Gary shifted in his seat. "Just thinking it might be time for changes. Man shouldn't stand still too long." After supper, while the other boarders retired to the parlor, Gary helped Faith clear the table, in action that clearly scandalized the elderly sisters, but seemed to amuse Mrs. Peterson. "Never seen a man so eager to handle dirty dishes," she remarked dryly before excusing herself to join the others, leaving Faith and Gary alone in the kitchen. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, Faith washing while Gary dried. The domesticity of the scene wasn't lost on Faith, how natural it felt to be working alongside him, how easily they moved around each other in the small space. "The pie was exceptional," Gary said finally, setting aside a dried plate. "Don't recall the last time I had home baking that good." Faith smiled, pleased by the compliment. "My mother's recipe. She believed a good pie crust was the mark of a true homemaker." Gary nodded thoughtfully. "She taught you well." He hesitated, then added, "Your boy, he's sleeping through the night now." "Most nights," Faith replied, touched by his concern for James. "Mrs. Peterson found a cradle in the attic. Makes things easier than trying to share the bed." Gary seemed to be working up to something, his fingers fidgeting with the dishcloth. "Faith, I've been meaning to ask," he broke off as Mrs. Peterson appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Goodwin, your son is awake and seems to be wanting his mother," she announced. "Mr. Townsend, the other boarders were hoping you might join them in the parlor. Mr. Finch is particularly eager to discuss cattle prices with someone knowledgeable." Whatever Gary had been about to say remained unspoken as they followed Mrs. Peterson from the kitchen. Faith felt a twinge of disappointment, but reminded herself that there would be other opportunities to talk. After all, Gary had mentioned staying in town for several days. As the evening drew to a close, Gary took his leave, thanking Mrs. Peterson for her hospitality and Faith for the meal. At the door, he paused, seeming reluctant to depart. "I'll be by tomorrow, if that's acceptable," he said, his eyes meeting Faith's. "Thought I might take you and the boy for a ride around town, show you the lay of the land. If you're not too busy with your new duties, that is." Faith glanced at Mrs. Peterson, who nodded her approval. "I think that would be lovely," Faith replied, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "James and I would enjoy that very much." Gary's face lit up with a smile that transformed his features, making him appear years younger. "Tomorrow then, say around midday." After he left, Faith found Mrs. Peterson watching her with an inscrutable expression. "Mr. Townsend seems quite taken with you and your son," the older woman observed mildly. Faith felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He's been very kind to us." Mrs. Peterson's shrewd eyes seemed to see more than Faith was ready to acknowledge, even to herself. Kindness is certainly one word for it. "Good night, Mrs. Goodwin. Sleep well." The following day dawned bright and clear, with a hint of spring in the air despite the snow still covering the ground. Faith dressed James in his warmest clothes and wrapped him securely in Gary's coat, which she now thought of as James's coat in preparation for their outing. Gary arrived precisely at noon, driving a handsome buggy rather than the wagon they'd used previously. He helped Faith and James into the seat, his hand lingering on hers perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Thought this might be more comfortable for touring the town," he explained as he took up the reins. Borrowed it from Henderson at the livery. He owed me a favor. Georgetown revealed itself to be larger and more developed than Faith had initially perceived. Gary showed them the church, the schoolhouse, the new brick bank building, and the territorial courthouse. He pointed out the better mercantiles, the doctor's office, and other establishments a new resident might need to know. As they passed a particularly elegant house on a hill overlooking the town, Gary slowed the buggy. "That's Judge Winter's place," he explained. "He and his wife are good people influential in the community. Mrs. Winters runs the Ladies' Aid Society. Might be worth making her acquaintance once you're settled." Faith nodded, taking mental notes. She was struck by how thoroughly Gary seemed to know Georgetown and its inhabitants, despite living some distance away. "You seem very familiar with the town for someone who prefers ranch life," she observed. Gary shrugged, guiding the buggy around a muddy patch in the road. "Come in regular for supplies and business. Small community, get to know folks whether you mean to or not." He glanced at her. "Truth is, I prefer the quiet of my valley, but a man can't be a complete hermit. Need to keep a foot in civilization, especially if," he broke off, focusing intently on the road ahead. "Especially if what?" Faith prompted gently. Gary seemed to consider his words carefully before responding. "Especially if a man's thinking about the future. The kind of future that might include more than just himself." Before Faith could pursue this intriguing statement, James began to fuss, hungry after their long outing. Gary immediately turned the buggy toward the boarding house. "We should get him back," he said, concern evident in his voice. "Getting cool out here now the sun's lower." At the boarding house, Gary helped Faith down from the buggy, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "Thank you for accompanying me today," he said formally, as if suddenly conscious of the potential for gossip in a small town. "It was our pleasure," Faith replied, equally formal though her heart was beating rather faster than the situation warranted. "Will we see you again before you return to your ranch?" Gary nodded, his expression serious. "I'd like that very much. Perhaps dinner tomorrow." "At the hotel restaurant. It's respectable enough that Mrs. Peterson wouldn't object, I think." Faith found herself agreeing before she'd fully considered the implications of dining out with a man not 3 weeks after her husband's death. But as she watched Gary drive away, she realized that conventional mourning periods seemed less important here in the territory, where life was harder and often shorter than back east. Thomas would want her to survive, to build a life for their son, and perhaps even to find happiness again, if the opportunity presented itself. The next evening, Faith dressed with particular care in her one good dress, a navy blue wool that had fortunately escaped damage during their journey. Mrs. Peterson, who had indeed approved of the dinner invitation with surprising enthusiasm, insisted on watching James. "Young mothers need occasional respite," she declared, waving away Faith's concerns. "Go, enjoy adult conversation without a baby on your lap for once. It will do you good." The hotel restaurant was the most elegant establishment Faith had seen since leaving St. Louis. White tablecloths, real silver cutlery, and glass oil lamps created an atmosphere of civilization that seemed almost incongruous in a mining town. Gary was waiting for her in the lobby, once again in his Sunday best, his expression a mixture of nervousness and pleasure at the sight of her. "You look lovely," he said simply, offering his arm to escort her inside. Dinner was a revelation. The food was excellent, but more surprising was the transformation in Gary. Away from the boarding house and its curious residents, he gradually relaxed, revealing a dry wit and an unexpected breadth of knowledge on subjects ranging from literature to politics. He spoke of his time in the Union Army with reluctance but candor, sharing enough for Faith to understand the shadows that sometimes crossed his features. "Lost my younger brother at Antietam," he confided quietly over dessert. "He was just 19. Followed me into the Army despite my objections, always did have more courage than sense. After that, I couldn't stomach the fighting anymore. When the war ended, I just wanted to get as far away as possible." Faith reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "I'm so sorry, Gary." He turned his hand to clasp hers, his palm rough with calluses but his touch gentle. Been a long time now, but I think about him often, what kind of man he might have become, the family he might have had. The moment of connection between them was palpable, a shared understanding of loss and its lasting impact. Faith found herself wanting to comfort him, to ease the old grief still evident in his eyes. "Tell me about your ranch," she said softly, changing the subject to something less painful. "It seemed peaceful, the little I saw of it." Gary's expression lightened as he described his land, the valley with its creek running through it, the meadows where his cattle grazed in summer, the stands of pine that provided shelter for deer and other wildlife. He spoke of his plans for expansion, for improvements to make the place more productive and comfortable. "Been thinking of adding rooms to the cabin," he said, a hint of something cautious in his voice. "Maybe a proper parlor, another bedroom or two." "It sounds wonderful," Faith replied sincerely. "A beautiful place to raise a family." Something shifted in Gary's gaze at her words, a decision made, a course determined. He took a deep breath, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "Faith, I know this is sudden, probably too sudden by most standards. And I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures." He opened the pouch, tipping a simple gold band into his palm. "This was my mother's. I've carried it with me since she passed, waiting for the right time, I suppose." Faith's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. "What I'm trying to say poorly, I'm afraid, is that I care for you and James. More than I thought possible in such a short time, and I'm asking if you might consider becoming my wife." Gary's voice was steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I can offer you a secure home, a good living, and my solemn promise to be a father to James in every way that matters. I won't try to replace Thomas in your heart, that's not my intention. But I believe we could build a good life together if you're willing." Faith sat perfectly still, overwhelmed by the unexpected proposal. A thousand thoughts raced through her mind, memories of Thomas, concerns about propriety, fears about making another life-altering decision so soon after the last one had ended in tragedy. "Gary, she paused, gathering her thoughts. "This is very unexpected." Gary nodded, his expression serious. "I understand it's sudden, and I'll respect whatever decision you make. There's no pressure for an immediate answer. I just wanted you to know my intentions are honorable and my feelings sincere." Faith studied his face, the earnest green eyes, the set of his jaw that spoke of determination and integrity, the gentleness that belied his rugged exterior. In the short time she'd known him, Gary Townsend had shown himself to be a man of uncommon decency and quiet strength. He'd saved her son's life without hesitation, offering his coat with those simple, profound words. "I've lived long enough. This little fella's just getting started." In that moment, he'd revealed the essence of his character: selfless, protective, unflinchingly brave in the face of his own potential suffering. What better qualities could she hope for in a husband and a father for James? "Yes," she said softly, the word emerging with surprising certainty. "Yes, I will marry you, Gary Townsend." The joy that transformed his face was something Faith knew she would remember for the rest of her days. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple band that somehow felt right, as if it had been waiting for her all along. "I'll make you happy, Faith," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "You and James both." The news of their engagement was received with varying reactions. Mrs. Peterson seemed unsurprised and thoroughly approving, while some of the boarding house residents murmured about the impropriety of such a hasty arrangement after Faith's bereavement. The town gossips had a field day, of course, but Faith found she cared less about their opinions than she might have expected. What mattered was the future she could see unfolding before her, a life with Gary in his peaceful valley, raising James in safety and security, perhaps adding to their family in time. It wasn't the future she had envisioned when she'd set out from Missouri with Thomas, but she was beginning to believe it might be a better one. They were married 2 weeks later in the Georgetown church, a simple ceremony with Mrs. Peterson standing as Faith's witness and Henderson from the livery as Gary's. James, resplendent in a new outfit Mrs. Peterson had insisted on purchasing, observed the proceedings with wide-eyed curiosity from the arms of one of the elderly sisters from the boarding house. As Faith spoke her vows, she felt a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place. This wasn't a romance born of youthful passion like her marriage to Thomas had been. It was something deeper, built on mutual respect and shared values, on gratitude that had blossomed into genuine affection, and then into love for Faith, had no doubt that what she felt for Gary was indeed love, different but no less real than what she'd felt for Thomas. After the ceremony, they returned to the boarding house for a small reception. Mrs. Peterson had outdone herself, preparing a feast that included Faith's apple pie and a wedding cake adorned with sugar flowers that must have been ordered specially from Denver. "A gift," the older woman said firmly when Faith tried to thank her. "Every bride deserves a proper cake." As the afternoon waned, Gary approached Faith with James in his arms. The baby had taken to Gary completely, often reaching for him when he entered a room. The sight of them together, her son secure in the strong arms of the man who had saved his life, never failed to touch Faith's heart. "Ready to head home?" Gary asked, his voice gentle. Home. The word held such promise now. "Yes," Faith replied, smiling up at her new husband. "Let's go home." The journey to the ranch was different this time, filled with anticipation rather than anxiety. Faith sat close to Gary on the wagon seat, James sleeping peacefully in her lap, wrapped in the coat that had once saved his life and now served as a constant reminder of how their unusual family had begun. As they crested the final rise, the valley spread out before them, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. The cabin looked just as Faith remembered it, small but sturdy, smoke curling from the chimney where Gary had arranged for a neighbor to light a fire in preparation for their arrival. But there was something new, a small corral behind the cabin that hadn't been there before, and inside it, a beautiful chestnut mare with a white blaze on her forehead. "Wedding present," Gary explained, noting her surprised expression. "Figured you might want your own horse once you're settled. She's gentle, good with children, named Penny for her color." It was the most thoughtful gift Faith had ever received, not just the mare itself, but what it represented: independence, partnership, Gary's understanding that she was a person with her own needs and desires, not simply an accessory to his life. "She's beautiful," Faith said softly. "Thank you." Gary helped her down from the wagon, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms, James still secure in her embrace. "Tradition says I should carry my bride across the threshold," he explained with a hint of a smile. "Though I don't recall it mentioning anything about the bride carrying a baby at the same time." Faith laughed, wrapping her free arm around his neck as he carried them both into the cabin. Inside, she found another surprise. The main room had been transformed with new curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on the bed, and a rocking chair positioned near the fireplace. "Mrs. Peterson helped," Gary admitted, setting Faith gently on her feet. "Said every new mother needs a proper rocking chair. The curtains and quilt came from the ladies at the church. Seems word got around about our situation." Faith felt tears spring to her eyes at the community's generosity. "It's perfect," she whispered, turning in a slow circle to take in her new home. "All of it." Later, after James had been fed and settled in the wooden crate that would serve as his bed until Gary finished building the proper crib he'd promised, they sat before the fire, the comfortable silence between them broken only by the crackle of burning logs and the occasional soft sound from the sleeping baby. "Happy?" Gary asked, his arm around Faith's shoulders, her head resting against him. Faith considered the question, thinking of all that had transpired since that desperate night when she'd collapsed on his doorstep with her freezing child in her arms. She'd lost a husband, a dream, a planned future, and yet somehow she'd found something she hadn't even known to look for. A love built not on passion and promises, but on actions and integrity, on quiet strength and unwavering support. "Yes," she answered truthfully. "I'm happy, Gary. Happier than I ever expected to be again." He turned to her then, his expression solemn in the firelight. "I meant what I said that night, you know, about having lived long enough. Wasn't planning to die exactly, but wasn't really living either. Just existing day to day." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "You and James, you gave me a reason to do more than just exist, to build something, to look forward instead of back." Faith reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "And you gave us a future when we had none. Seems we saved each other." His kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if he still couldn't quite believe she was truly his. Faith responded with growing confidence, her arms winding around his neck as she leaned into him, into this new life they were creating together. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling around the corners of the cabin, not the deadly howl of that fateful winter night, but a softer sound, almost musical in its cadence. Inside, warmth and light and the beginnings of a family bound not by blood, but by choice, by chance. By the simple act of a good man offering his coat to a dying child and unwittingly opening the door to a love he'd never expected to find. Spring came early to the valley that year, bringing with it new growth and possibilities. Gary made good on his promise to expand the cabin, adding a proper bedroom for James and a small parlor that quickly became Faith's favorite space, with shelves for the books they ordered from Denver and windows that let in the morning light. James thrived in his new home, growing stronger and more adventurous by the day. He took his first steps holding onto Gary's fingers, spoke his first word "pa" during breakfast one morning, and demonstrated from the earliest age his father's affinity for animals and the outdoors. Faith found unexpected contentment in ranch life. She planted a vegetable garden that soon expanded to include herbs and flowers, kept chickens for eggs and meat, and learned to ride Penny with growing confidence, often taking James with her on short excursions around the valley while Gary tended to the cattle. They made regular trips into Georgetown for supplies and to maintain the friendships they'd established there. Mrs. Peterson, in particular, became a frequent visitor to the ranch, delighting in her self-appointed role as James's honorary grandmother. Life wasn't without its challenges, of course. The work was hard, the weather sometimes unforgiving, and the isolation occasionally wore on Faith's spirits. But through it all, Gary remained her steadfast partner, his quiet strength a constant she could rely on without question. Their love deepened with time, growing from the initial foundation of respect and gratitude into something rich and complex. A tapestry woven of shared experiences, mutual support, and the daily choice to put one another first. They disagreed at times, as any couple might, but never went to sleep without resolving their differences. Never let the sun set on their anger. In the fall of their first year of marriage, Faith discovered she was expecting their second child. The news filled Gary with a mixture of joy and trepidation, joy at the expanding family he'd never dared to dream of, trepidation at the prospect of Faith giving birth so far from town and medical assistance. "We'll move into Georgetown for the last month," he decided, brooking no argument on this point. "Mrs. Peterson's already offered us rooms at the boarding house. You'll have proper care when the time comes," Faith agreed, touched by his concern. "This baby is strong," she assured him, guiding his hand to the swell of her belly where their child kicked vigorously. Like its father. Their son, William Garrett Townsend, was born on a crisp April morning in 1874, a healthy, robust boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's green eyes. Gary, who had paced the boarding house hallway for hours during the delivery, held his newborn son with tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "He's perfect," he whispered, gazing in wonder at the tiny features, just like his mother. James, not quite 2 years old, approached the bed cautiously, eyeing his new brother with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. "Baby," he pronounced solemnly, reaching out a pudgy hand to touch William's even tinier fingers. "That's right, sweetheart," Faith said, smiling through her own tears of joy and exhaustion. "This is your brother, William. You're going to be a wonderful big brother." As she watched her family Gary cradling their newborn while James leaned against his father's leg, peering up at the baby, Faith felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it nearly overwhelmed her. From the depths of despair, from the edge of death in a snowstorm, had come this abundance of love and life. They returned to the ranch when William was 3 weeks old, the valley now lush with spring growth, wildflowers carpeting the meadows. Gary had used their time in town to hire extra hands for the ranch, ensuring Faith wouldn't be overburdened with two young children to care for. Life settled into a new rhythm, more demanding, but also more rewarding. Faith discovered that mothering two boys so close in age required every ounce of her energy and creativity, but she wouldn't have traded it for any other existence. Watching James guide his little brother, seeing Gary's tender interaction with both boys, filled her heart with a contentment she hadn't known was possible. As the years passed, the ranch prospered under Gary's careful management. They added more land, more cattle, eventually building a larger house to accommodate their growing family. William was joined by a sister, Elizabeth, in 1877 and another brother, Michael, in 1880. Each child was uniquely precious, but Faith and Gary always shared a special bond with James, the child whose life had brought them together, whose survival had been the catalyst for their unlikely love story. On James's 7th birthday, Gary presented him with a special gift, a small wooden horse, exquisitely carved and polished to a glossy finish. "This is the first thing I ever made for you," Gary explained as James examined the toy with delighted eyes. "Started it the night you and your mother came to the cabin. Wasn't sure then if you'd pull through, but I kept working on it, hoping you would." James looked up at the only father he'd ever known, his expression solemn beyond his years. "Because you gave me your coat." Gary exchanged a glance with Faith, surprised that James remembered or had perhaps been told this detail. "That's right, son. You needed it more than I did." James nodded, carefully placing the carved horse on the mantel where it would be safe from his younger sibling's curious hands. "Mama says that's why she fell in love with you, because you were willing to be cold so I could be warm." Faith felt heat rise to her cheeks as Gary's gaze found hers, his eyes filled with the same quiet devotion that had sustained them through 7 years of marriage. "Your mama gives me too much credit," he said softly. "Truth is, I was already halfway to loving her from the moment I saw her on my doorstep, holding you so fierce and protective-like, bravest thing I'd ever seen." That night, after the children were asleep, Faith and Gary sat on the porch of their home, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against him in what had become their customary position for these quiet evening moments. "Did you really fall in love with me because I gave James my coat?" Gary asked, curiosity evident in his voice. Faith considered the question carefully. "Not just because of that," she replied truthfully. "But it was the first glimpse I had of the man you truly are, someone who would sacrifice his own comfort, his own safety, for a child he'd never met. Someone who understood, instinctively, what matters most in this life." She turned to face him, her hand finding his in the gathering darkness. "I fell in love with you because of 1,000 small kindnesses after that first big one. Because of the way you built James a cradle without being asked, the way you worried about us even after we were safe at the boarding house. The way you never, ever made me feel like a burden, even though we must have been." Gary squeezed her hand. "You and James were never a burden, Faith. You were a gift I didn't know I was waiting for." 10 years after that snowy night that had changed the course of their lives, the Townsend family gathered for a special celebration, their 10th wedding anniversary, coinciding with the completion of the new schoolhouse Gary had helped build for the growing community that had sprung up in their valley. The celebration was held in the schoolhouse itself, with neighbors and friends from miles around attending. Mrs. Peterson, now in her 70s but still sharp as ever, had traveled from Georgetown for the occasion, bringing with her a beautifully embroidered tablecloth as an anniversary gift. 10 years, she marveled, embracing Faith warmly. "When I think of that frightened young woman who arrived at my boarding house, I can scarcely believe the confident, accomplished woman before me now." Faith smiled, watching as her 4 children played with the other youngsters while Gary conversed with neighbors, his tall frame easy to spot in the crowd. "Sometimes I can scarcely believe it myself," she admitted. How different my life might have been without that broken wagon wheel, that snowstorm, Gary opening his door that night. Mrs. Peterson patted her hand knowingly. "Providence works in mysterious ways, my dear. Some might call it chance, but I prefer to think it was all part of a greater plan." Later, as twilight descended and lanterns were lit around the schoolhouse yard, Gary found Faith standing slightly apart from the festivities, gazing up at the star-filled sky. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, coming to stand beside her. Faith smiled, leaning into his familiar warmth. "I was thinking about James Thomas, wondering what he would think if he could see us now." Gary was silent for a moment, respecting her mention of her first husband, a subject they rarely discussed but never treated as taboo. "I'd like to think he'd be pleased," he said finally. "Knowing his son has grown up happy and healthy, knowing you found contentment." Faith nodded, grateful as always for Gary's generosity of spirit. "I think he would be. He wasn't perfect, who is? But he wanted good things for us." She turned to face her husband, taking in the features that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes. Deeper now than when they'd first met, the silver threading through his dark hair and beard, the steadiness of his gaze that had never wavered in 10 years of marriage. "I love you, Gary Townsend," she said simply, "more with each passing day." His smile, still capable of quickening her heartbeat after all this time, spread slowly across his face. "And I love you, Faith Townsend, from the moment you appeared on my doorstep to whatever lies beyond our last breath." He took her hand, leading her back toward the gathering where their children awaited James, now a lanky boy of 11 with his mother's thoughtful nature, William, sturdy and confident at 9, Elizabeth, their spirited 7-year-old daughter, and Michael, a curious 4-year-old who adored his older siblings. As they rejoined the celebration, Faith felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. From the depths of tragedy, a husband lost, a baby nearly frozen, a future that had seemed impossibly bleak had emerged this rich tapestry of love and family, of community and purpose. And it had all begun with a simple act of sacrifice, a coat given freely, a man who had looked at a dying child and said, without hesitation, "I've lived long enough. This little fella's just getting started."